Please welcome Alice Hoffman, American novelist.
It's always darkest before the dawn. Check it out, check it out, check it out, check it out.
Can you hear me okay? I'm Alice Hoffman. It was interesting getting her today. Oh, can you hear me now? Okay. Today, upstairs, it's all men. Have you noticed that? Oh, you probably haven't been up there. And then you come down here, and there are all these women, and it's great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm a novelist, and I became a writer because I was a reader. I've written, I actually don't know, I think I've written about 30 novels, 3 books of linked short stories, 11 books for teens and children, and for many years I was a screenwriter in Hollywood. But the best advice I ever got that stayed with me from my writing professor, Albert Gerard, was the opposite of what most writers are told when they're young. He told me, don't write what you know, write what you can imagine. And that was extremely freeing to me. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about women in the ancient world and the power of women in the ancient world. The funny thing for me is that creating a world as a novelist, when I first walked onto a film set, I felt like the person that I was most similar to was the set designer, because the set designer creates a world for the characters to walk into. And I felt like that's very much what a novelist does. So with each book, I create a world. I've done research in the past. I wrote a book called Incantation, which was about the Spanish Inquisition, a book called The Ice Queen, which was about lightning. I wrote a book called The Third Angel about 60s London. And my new book, which will be out in August, is called The Marriage of Opposites, and it's about the artist Camille Pissarro's mother, who has basically been stricken from history, and I just wanted to be able to give her a voice. But nothing really prepared me for the challenges of writing a book like The Dove Keepers. The Dove Keepers, for me, it was a completely new experience. I did not grow up as an observant Jew. My grandparents on my mother's side were socialists. I knew nothing about Jewish holidays. I knew a little bit about Passover. I knew nothing about the history of the Jewish people. I didn't speak Hebrew. I didn't know anything about the Middle East. I knew nothing about the Bible, and I didn't even know who David and Solomon were. As a visiting scholar at Brandeis, where I was when I wrote the book, The Dove Keepers, I had access to the library. And at the end of the process, I had a part-time undergraduate student researcher who, luckily for me, was Orthodox, knew Hebrew, and happened to be a natural researcher. And it was very comforting. Every time I had an issue, she would say, "Don't worry, I'll call my rabbi and see what he thinks." For those who don't know the story, Masada is a fortress in Judea, originally built by King Herod 100 years before the siege. It was coveted by Cleopatra, but she never got it. It was abandoned. It was taken over by the Romans, and then it was finally taken over by a group of Jewish zealots when all of the Jews were driven from Jerusalem during the fall of the Second Temple. It was here many fled in 70 CE, and the only account of this history is given to us by Josephus, who was known to be both a flatterer and a liar, who changed sides when it suited him, but who was so specific that many archaeological discoveries have been made because of the descriptions in his work. It was said that he was Titus's right-hand man during the siege of Jerusalem, so he worked with the Romans, but he was also a Jew, and his text was the text I most often referred to, but I always took it with a grain of salt. It was he who said that there were survivors, and those survivors were at the heart of my novel. When I realized, some writers realize that they have a theme only toward the end of their careers, and I realized that I'm always writing about survivorship. And in fact, I'm a breast cancer survivor, and I've been very involved. Oh, thank you. And I know there's 1 out of 7 of us is a survivor, will be a survivor. And I've been very involved with the Mount Auburn Hoffman Breast Center. We've had authors events every year, and it's an incredible center where no person, this is what I'm proudest of, is that no person is ever turned away, no matter what their insurance or their situation is. So the themes in my work about love and loss and survivorship really began, I think, with my grandmother, who was a Russian Jew who came to this country with nothing and who told me stories about Russia and about being an immigrant woman in New York City at the turn of the century. She also told me fairy tales and folk tales. And I realized that this is really women's literature. And not just women's literature, it's the beginning of all literature. That literature began with the stories that grandmothers told their grandchildren. And later, many of these stories were written down by men like the Grimms and became these wonderful books of fairy tales. But originally, they were women's stories because the stories of women are always an oral tradition. They don't get written down. And unfortunately, because of that, many times they're lost. For me, The Dove Keepers is a very specific and particular story. It's about 4 women who went through the siege of Masada. But it's also, I think, a timeless, universal story about women in war who must protect their children. And I remember when I was starting out as a writer, I felt, well, when I was in school, especially in high school, the only women that we read were either British or dead. So I felt like I didn't have a chance. You know, I'd never met a writer. And I felt like if I can't write about war, can I write a great novel? You know, we're all great novels about war. And I started to slowly realize, and The Dove Keepers is a novel about war, that women and children are also involved with war, and that women have a greater reason to want peace then and now, because they want survivorship and they want their children to survive. I think, you know, when people ask how is a writer drawn to a story, I think it's a combination of experience and psychology and both the conscious and subconscious mind working together. One of the things that drew me to this story, and I think this happens to many of us, is that when you have children, they lead you to places you would never expect to go to. And you become interested in subjects that you never thought you would be interested in. And my son is an archaeologist. One of the sad things for me was that he was never a reader. And for me, my mother and I connected over reading. That even when we didn't talk to each other, we still read the same books and shared the same books. And one of the things that, for me as a writer, is very rewarding is that I have a lot of mother-daughter readers. It used to be that mothers would introduce their daughters to my work, and now I also write children's books. I have a book called Nightbird that's coming out tomorrow, and I had a funny thing happen that I overheard. I was at this authors festival in Tucson, where I'm actually going again, and I overheard this 10-year-old girl say to her mother, "Oh, there's Alice Hoffman. We could have her book signed." And her mother said, "Who's Alice Hoffman?" And the 10-year-old girl said, "You don't know who Alice Hoffman is?" And I thought, she's my reader now. You know, I'm not just writing for the mothers, I'm also writing for the daughters. And The Dove Keepers is very much about that mother-daughter bond. So my son worked at a couple of sites in Israel. He worked at Tel Rahiv, and he also worked at Megiddo, which is supposed to be the biblical Armageddon. And his stories from the past made me realize that what an archaeologist is looking for is the same thing as a novelist. Looking for what makes up a character, what makes up a world. The stories of the artifacts of the past were riveting to me, and his interest in archaeology at first led me to read about the tombs that were found in southern Russia. I wrote a book for teens called The Foretelling about Amazon women that were based on these tombs in the south of Russia, where red-haired women were buried with their horses and their weapons. But when I went to Israel with my son, my first visit, nobody told me not to go in August. It was 105 degrees. And when I went to Masada, luckily for me, we were the only people there. And I think because we were the only people there, I felt a spiritual connection to that place that I didn't expect to feel. I felt as if I could hear the voices of the women who came before me, not just my grandmothers, but my grandmother's grandmothers, all the way back to the original women. I grew up with 2 grandmothers who were very different, but they both told me stories, and they were the most important people in my life. And I always feel like if you have a grandmother who believes in you, you really don't need much else. In the end, all of history and all of archaeology is showing us stories of the past. But there are some stories that we can never know because they were secret, because they were shared by that oral tradition that I was talking about, because the storytellers couldn't write or were afraid to write down their truth, or because they were too personal or too magical and they were only meant for a daughter's ears. The artifacts in the Masada Museum are woven through the book. They become part of the characters, and they helped me to create the characters. There's a tartan plaid fabric that belonged to a Roman conscript who came from some Celtic nation. There are the skeletons of 3 people that were found at a fountain, a boy and a young man surrounded by silver scales of armor, and a young woman whose hair and shoes are on exhibit, and these 3 became characters for me. There were 25 skeletons found in a cave below the fortress, and many scrolls of the Essene people. That was a sect that was found there as well, and in my story, the Essenes are part of the early Jesus movement, and their practices echo the first Christian practices. And Josephus, who tells the story of Masada, is also the only secular account that we have in history of Jesus' life. There's also jewelry and coins, a shell from the Red Sea that was used as a makeup palette, all the artifacts of real life used by women. And they brought these characters to life for me. I think, the lack of women's stories in the ancient world. There are only 158 women mentioned in the Bible, and very few by name, more by association with a man, like Lot's wife. Women's knowledge is often hidden knowledge, and it's transmitted from mother to daughter and from grandmother to granddaughter. I discovered that women's traditions of magic and medicine were the same. As a novelist who's not an academic, my greatest challenge was to find out the details of domestic life because nobody wrote that down. And one of my biggest arguments was with a scholar, and our argument was over whether or not one of my characters is a ritual prostitute, which there were ritual prostitutes in every religion at this time, and there were artifacts that can lead us to believe that, and he just refused to believe that Jewish women were ever prostitutes. And I said, well, nobody wrote that book. I was a Jewish prostitute. So, if you don't write it down, it disappears. So I often found my answers in the lives of current nomadic people: how to make cheese, how to make a rug, what doves were used for, what gardens were like. What I'd like to do is just read you a tiny bit from in the voice of one of the characters. It's funny, somebody was asking me about the difference between a novel and a screenplay, or a novel and a movie, and I was a screenwriter for a long time, for 20 years, and I've also had some of my own books turned into films, and they're very, very different. They're very different. A novelist is alone in the process and creates the world by herself, and a film is so completely, there are so many people involved, and it doesn't really belong to anyone. It belongs to a community. And somebody said, well, did you feel okay about the changes that were made in the Dove Keepers? And I said, I knew, and I told the producers, that anything is fine with me, whatever you do is fine. And then they said, well, because it's going to be 4 hours, we had to get rid of one of the characters. And I was just like beside myself. How could she not exist? And I realized, she exists in the book, but not in the film. One of the characters that does exist in both is a character called Shira. And I'm going to just read to you a little bit from her voice. She is known as the Witch of Moab. My mother taught me everything a woman must know in this world, and all that it's necessary to carry into the world to come. By the age of 8, I had learned that the leaf of a date palm boiled in water was a cure for scorpion bites, and that the nectar of the blue flower of the hyssop dabbed on the wrist would ward off evil, that the burned, powdery skin of a snake would keep a man from harm. I had the tooth of a black dog strung around my neck as protection against wild beasts, and I took to reciting an incantation when I dug around the roots of henbane, the holy plant, for I often buried my mother's amulets as offering to Ashtoreth, the goddess who watched over us in times of strife. My mother trained me in the making of fever charms and victory charms, and although she refused to deal in hate spells used to undermine rivals, something that was lacking in my book of recipes, I knew how to cast charms that would dissolve a spell, those that would cure reptile bites. Bits of silver scrolls and scarabs were sewn into the hem of my garments by my mother. Her great beauty was eclipsed only by her great knowledge. It is said, there were spells on every page of my mother's diary for night blindness, to catch a thief, for headache, for fever, for loyalty, for love. While other girls were playing with string or carved wooden animals, I was learning what had been written by my mother, secrets passed down to me that I would one day entrust to a daughter of my own. The spells were transcribed in code, so though no outsider could understand them. There have always been ancient books of mysteries. Men who practiced magic were teachers. They were called Abba, fathers, and they were blessed by knowledge from the book of mysteries. Even Moses was said to have what magicians and great teachers called the moon book, a collection of magic so strong no other human has ever dared to open the pages, lest he be burned alive by the heat of the words within. There were those who said that Moses could make the sea disappear and that he could have destroyed the whole world had he wished to, or if God had called upon him to do so. Noah, too, had a book of incantations. Among men, it was rumored that there was a priceless treasure called the Book of Watchers, which offered direct instructions from the Almighty. A mystical book so complicated, so hidden and wrapped within riddles that only the wisest sage could begin to understand its meaning. But this was the work of men, of scholars and priests. There were two schools of magic that men were privy to, and that which the priests practiced publicly and that which they practiced privately. Beyond that, in secret, in the dark, there was the magic that women practiced behind locked doors, with our recipe books and our medicines and our love potions. Women had secret uses for ashes and bay leaves, for blood and sulfur and myrrh and musk and honey. At the temple, it had been decreed that no one should tolerate a sorceress, for such magic was said to be the work of harlots, their wickedness set beneath a mantle of wisdom. They should not be allowed. There were 10 varieties of wise men known, but only 2 kinds of women who might hear the voice of the Almighty: prophetesses and witches. For women who practiced in secret, there was no one but him, our God, the radiant one, who was greater than any magician. But we did not agree with the rules of men, and we ignored certain decrees, even though they were the sort of magic women such as my mother was known for, was outside the law and said to be a sin. So that's the voice of one of the characters of the Dove Keepers, who's a witch. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how the miniseries came to be, which is kind of magical all by itself. I got a call from Roma Downey, and she said she had read my book on a plane, The Dove Keepers. And then she was at home, and her husband, Mark Burnett, was producing a show called The Sing-Off. And 2 of my friends actually were also the producers on that show. And Roma thought to herself, because this is, it's such a big commitment when you make a movie, and she really committed herself to it. She said, if I get some sort of sign that I should make this movie, then I'll go ahead. And if I don't, then I'm going to let it go. I'm just going to see what happens. And she happened to be sitting in the audience during the show, The Sing-Off, and Sarah Bareilles was one of the judges. It was a good show. And my friend Deb Newmeyer was sitting next to her, and Deb turned to Roma and said, "Have you ever read a book called The Dove Keepers? It's written by my friend Alice Hoffman." And that was the moment that Roma knew that she was going to go ahead, and we talked after that. And what was also very interesting, this may be the magic that kind of makes films happen. The screenwriter that they were interested in and was a very important part, really kind of changed the story, but very, very much kept to the feeling and the emotions of what the Dove Keepers is all about. Her last name was Peacock. And Roma said that she looked out the window on the day that she had to decide whether or not she was going to hire her, and there was a white peacock in her yard. I mean, yes, it was Malibu and it escaped from the neighbor next door, but still, it was a sign. And so I just really wanted to thank you for inviting me to be here with you. I think it's really important for us to remember the past and remember the women that came before us, because if you forget it, it disappears. And that's what history is all about. And I think, you know, especially for our children and for those of us lucky enough to have daughters, I think the history of women is extremely important to remember. So now I thank you for having me here. We're just going to show you a little bit of the Dove Keepers Brought to Life. I hope you enjoy it. It's going to be on March 31st and April 1st, and it really does bring this world to life. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
So, let us begin.
From the international bestseller comes the story of 3 extraordinary women
I wonder how a lioness will manage in a dove coat.
I'm hardly a lioness.
trapped in a mountain fortress called Masada.
They say this mountain is invisible. They believe their god pulled a curtain over it. They were wrong.
Where hundreds of rebels faced thousands of soldiers.
Freedom or death!
And where they discovered their destiny.
How will we defeat them?
We fight.
Yahweh, our spirits are dry!
They don't see me. No one does.
And can you defend yourself, my little dove?
Try me. I want to be a warrior. Let me be who I am.
Do you think this child will ever see peace?
That's what I'll be fighting for.
Some days it's hard to see. If I was a fool or you a thief.
You don't fear things like other women.
I'm not a woman. I'm a warrior.
And I gave you this sky.
All that interests me is the truth. I will write your story.
Somebody like you was so.
We believed God was on the side of the innocent.
Oh, that I had the wings of a dove. I would fly away and be at rest.